You forgot to disable location history.
How did you find me?
I always know where you are.
Please just leave me alone.
It's too late for that.
She didn't quit because she stopped caring. She quit because she started to. And in the world of Seo Ji-hwan, where caring was the most dangerous thing a person could do, Nia Okoye did the only logical thing left. She disappeared. The problem with disappearing around a man who controls 3 districts, 2 ports, and the kind of silence that makes senators nervous? He notices the quiet. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, make yourself comfortable, because we don't do boring stories. A man who owns half a city just drove himself to Busan over a resignation letter. Hit like, subscribe, and let's find out if power has a limit, or if Nia does. The desk sat empty for 3 days before anyone said anything out loud. This was partly because the staff of Seo Group were professionally trained to observe without commenting, to know without knowing, and to understand that asking questions in this building was a hobby with terrible consequences. And partly because nobody could quite believe it. Nia Okoye did not simply leave. Nia Okoye was the woman who had once rescheduled a meeting between 2 rival faction heads during the meeting, in real time, with a straight face and a revised calendar invite, because she had sensed, not been told, that the energy in the room had shifted from negotiation to something that required more space and fewer witnesses. She had managed crises that never made the news, had coordinated exits from situations that had no official names, had once prevented a minor international incident using sparkling water and the precise deployment of a very polite smile. She was, in the truest sense, indispensable, which was exactly why she left. On the 4th day, Ji-hwan's 8:15 a.m. briefing had no notes prepared. His 10 a.m. call had not been confirmed with the overseas party. His 11:30 lunch was with the wrong person. Some well-meaning junior coordinator named Hyeon Soo, who arrived with a printed agenda and a hopeful expression, and who lasted approximately 7 minutes before Ji-hwan's silence made him quietly gather his papers and leave without either of them acknowledging what had happened. By afternoon, the head of operations had worked up the particular type of courage that only comes from having no other options. He knocked. "She submitted a resignation letter, sir, 4 days ago." Ji-hwan did not look up from the document on his desk. "I know." A pause. The head of operations recalibrated. "Should we begin a search for her replacement?" Ji-hwan turned a page. "No." The door closed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had received his answer and was grateful to still be employed. Here is what nobody on the 34th floor understood about Seo Ji-hwan. He was not a man who processed things loudly. He processed things thoroughly. There was a difference. Loud men flipped tables and made statements. Ji-hwan simply went still in a way that made the furniture nervous. He had read the resignation letter once. 4 sentences. Clean. Professional. Utterly devoid of the kind of emotional language that might have given him something to argue against. There was no accusation, no explanation. Not even the corporate theater of it has been an honor. Just the facts, her signature, and an exit so clean it could have been a masterclass. He had recognized the technique. He had taught it to her, indirectly, by example, over 4 years of watching him close doors without slamming them, end things without announcement, and make decisions that rearranged the landscape before anyone realized the geography had changed. She had learned from the best. He almost respected it. Almost. What he actually felt, though he would not have used this word in any language, was something uncomfortably close to outmaneuvered. And for a man who had not been outmaneuvered since a business negotiation in his late 20s that he still occasionally reviewed for lessons, this was a singular experience. He picked up his phone, he put it down, he stood at the window. Seoul sprawled below him, rain gray and indifferent, full of 10 million people who went about their lives without requiring his attention. Somewhere in that city, or beyond it, his instinct said beyond it, was a woman who had spent 4 years sitting 12 steps from his office door and had apparently decided that was 12 steps too many. He pulled up the internal system. Her access card had been returned, her files transferred, her company email auto-forwarding to a general inbox. He checked the timestamp on her last system login, 3:48 a.m. The morning she left. He stared at that for a moment with the expression of a man doing math he doesn't like the answer to. She had stayed until nearly 4 in the morning finishing handover notes. Thorough, organized, complete, because of course she had. Because even when she walked out, Nia Okoye made sure nothing was left undone. She was annoying that way. He closed the system, opened a different one. If you think Seo Ji-hwan was going to simply post the position on a job board and move forward like a sensible person, drop a comment below and tell us. because clearly someone believes in miracles. And if you've ever worked for someone who watched you just a little too carefully, like this video before you finished watching, because you already know exactly where this story is going. He found the thread 3 hours later, not through his security team, not through the official tracking systems he absolutely did not use for personal matters and would deny in any setting. Through the location history on a company-adjacent cloud account she had briefly used, 3 weeks before her resignation, to access a document she needed offline, a sublet confirmation. Busan, he read the address twice. Then he did something his entire organization would have found deeply alarming if they'd known about it. He went to get his own car keys. Nia Okoye was on day 11 of her freedom, and she was, by any reasonable measure, thriving. She had a small apartment 2 blocks from the sea. She had good coffee. She had silence that belonged to her, not the loaded, pressurized silence of a man standing at a window waiting for her to say something she wasn't going to say. Just regular silence, the kind that asked nothing of you. She had slept 8 hours for 3 consecutive nights, which felt so foreign her body had spent the first night slightly suspicious of it. She was fine. She was completely fine. She was lying on her couch at 11 p.m. reading a novel, an actual novel, fiction, something with no strategic implications whatsoever, when her phone buzzed with a delivery notification. She wasn't expecting a package. She signed for it anyway because the delivery man looked cold and she had not entirely lost her manners along with her employment. Inside the box was her old work phone, charged, turned on, one message on the screen. You forgot to disable location history. Naya set the phone down on the kitchen counter. She looked at it. She picked up her novel. She put her novel down. She looked at the phone again. She, a woman who had written a 7-page memo on digital security vulnerabilities, who had trained 3 different teams on data exposure risks across 2 continents, who had flagged surveillance gaps in systems that made this one look like a children's toy, had left her location history on a personal phone, used from his office. 3 weeks before she quit. The silence in her Busan apartment was no longer the peaceful kind. It was the kind that comes right before a black car appears outside your window. She looked. There it was. She did not run. This was the part people always got wrong about Nia Okoye. They assumed that because she was composed, she was unafraid. They assumed that because she moved quietly, she could be startled into stillness. They assumed, in the particular way that people always assumed about women who did not perform their emotions publicly, that the calm was a costume. It was not a costume. It was a conclusion. She had reached it sometime between reading the message and watching the black car ease to a stop outside her building with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that had never once been told it couldn't park there. The conclusion was simple. Running was for people who believed distance was the same as safety. And Naya Okoye, who had spent 4 years inside the operational reality of So Ji-hwan's world, understood with absolute clarity that distance and safety were 2 entirely different zip codes. If he had wanted her collected, she would not have received a package. She would have simply found herself somewhere else, with no memory of the journey. The fact that she was standing in her own doorway, in her own clothes, watching him step out of a car he had apparently driven himself, no security, no entourage, not even a second vehicle, told her everything about what kind of visit this was. It did not tell her what to do with that information. He walked toward her the way he walked into every room, like the architecture had been expecting him. Dark suit, no tie, which was unusual. His collar was open by exactly 1 button, which on any other man would have meant nothing, and on Ji-hwan meant he had left in a hurry and hadn't noticed, or had noticed and decided not to care, and she genuinely could not determine which was more alarming. He stopped 1 step away. The sea air moved between them, salt and wind, and the distant sound of Busan going about its evening with complete indifference to the situation unfolding on this particular sidewalk. You disappeared, he said. His voice was even, controlled. The specific register he used when he was having a feeling, and had decided the feeling did not have permission to show up in his vocal cords. You accepted my resignation, Nia said. I accepted paperwork. She looked at him. That's what a resignation is. That's what you decided it was. The audacity, she thought, was genuinely impressive. The man had tracked her across 2 cities using a location history she had forgotten to disable, a fact she was still internally processing with the energy of someone discovering a very expensive typo, and was now standing outside her apartment, reframing her legal employment termination as a miscommunication. You drove yourself, she said. Not a question. An observation she needed confirmed because it was still slightly unbelievable. Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort. The cousin of discomfort. My driver asks questions, and I don't? You ask better ones. Nia folded her arms. This was the thing about Seo Ji-hwan that no external profile, no intelligence briefing, no second-hand account ever managed to capture accurately. The man was, underneath the empire, and the silence, and the particular way he had of making senators rearrange their schedules precise. Not charming. Precision was not charm. Charm was warm and performed and designed to make you lower your guard. Precision was different. Precision saw you accurately and said so without decoration, and somehow that was infinitely more dangerous than any amount of charm had ever been. Come inside, she said finally, not because she had decided anything, because the neighbors had begun to exist. He followed her up without comment. Her apartment was small by any standard and catastrophically small by his. She watched him take it in with a single, quiet sweep, the second-hand furniture, the novel face down on the couch, the coffee mug she hadn't washed, the window with its direct line to the sea. She waited for something to register on his face. Judgment. Adjustment. The micro-expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of where she had landed. Nothing. He looked at the view. You can see the water, he said. That was the point. He turned from the window and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention he usually reserved for documents that required decisions. 4 years, he said. You never once told me what you wanted. Nia felt something shift in her chest that she immediately evicted. That wasn't my job. No, he agreed quietly. It wasn't. A pause that had weight. I'm making it one now. She stared at him. He stared back. And somewhere in the space between his question and her silence, the negotiation that neither of them had agreed to enter had already begun. The problem with inviting Seo Ji-hwan into your living space was that he did not shrink to fit it. Most people, when placed in a small apartment with second-hand furniture and a coffee mug that hadn't been washed since Tuesday, made unconscious adjustments. They softened their posture, lowered their register, performed a kind of social humility that said, I see your space, and I am respecting its scale. Ji-hwan simply stood in her living room like he had always intended to be there, and the apartment was the one that needed to catch up. Nia put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands that wasn't gesturing expressively at him and asking what, precisely, he thought he was doing in Busan on a Tuesday evening in an open collar and no security detail. The kettle was a good decision. The kettle was neutral. The kettle had no complicated history. Sit, she said without looking at him. The sound of him settling onto her couch was unreasonably calm for a man who had just driven 4 hours based on a cloud document timestamp. You finished the Incheon handover notes, he said. She set 2 mugs on the counter. Of course I did. At 3:48 in the morning, she paused for half a second, just half, then continued reaching for the tea. I don't leave things unfinished. I know, he said. And there was something in those 2 words that was doing considerably more work than 2 words had any right to do. She could feel it from across the kitchen, which was saying something given that her kitchen was essentially a suggestion rather than a room. She brought the tea, set his down with the precision of a woman who had spent 4 years anticipating exactly how he took it. Black, no sugar, cup positioned to his right, and then caught herself doing it, and felt a specific, private irritation that she absolutely did not show. He noticed anyway. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. That was the central problem and had always been the central problem. In a world full of powerful men who looked at the people around them and saw functions, assistants, advisors, instruments of efficiency, Ji-hwan had the deeply inconvenient habit of actually seeing. Not warmly, not expressively, but accurately, which was worse. Warmth could be dismissed. Accuracy stayed with you. You knew, she said, sitting across from him with her own mug. Before I resigned, you knew something had shifted. It wasn't a question either. They were apparently doing that now, speaking in observations instead of interrogatives, because questions implied you might not get an answer, and neither of them was willing to perform that particular vulnerability. Yes, he said, and you said nothing. I said something at the dinner. You said 4 words. They were specific words. Nia looked at him over her mug. Ji-hwan, you told me I'd been avoiding you. That is not a declaration. That is an accusation dressed in a suit. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one. I'm not good at declarations. I'm aware. I scheduled your life for 4 years. I once had to rephrase your apology to the Tokyo board because what you wrote read like a threat assessment. It was accurate. It used the word consequences 4 times. They needed to understand the consequences. Ji-hwan. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Busan hummed its evening sounds, traffic, the distant sea, someone on a floor above moving furniture with the energy of a person who had made a decision about their living room and was committed to it. I don't, he started, stopped, looked at his tea, started again with the careful deliberateness of a man who was used to choosing words for legal documents and was applying that same precision to something that had no legal framework whatsoever. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. I know how to run operations. I know how to read rooms and manage outcomes and make decisions that other people find difficult. A pause. I don't know how to tell someone that the building felt structurally different when they left. Nia was very still. This was not what she had prepared for. She had prepared for commands. For the version of Ji Huan that negotiated everything, that framed even personal matters as terms to be agreed upon. She had prepared for come back because I need my operations running cleanly, or come back because your replacement is inadequate, or even, in her more dramatic imaginings on nights when the sea air was too quiet, come back because I said so. She had not prepared for the building felt structurally different. Because that's the most human thing you've ever said to me, she said quietly. He met her eyes. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. And there it was, the dry, almost invisible humor he deployed so rarely that when it appeared, it hit with the impact of something you hadn't seen coming. She felt the laugh before it arrived and pressed her lips together with the discipline of a woman who understood that laughing right now would rearrange the entire power structure of this conversation. She laughed anyway, just briefly, just enough. And Ji Huan watched her with the expression of a man who had just discovered that this, specifically this, was what he had driven 4 hours for. Not an answer, not a resolution. Just the sound of her laughing in a small apartment by the sea, with bad furniture and an unwashed mug, completely free of his world, and him sitting in the middle of it, uninvited, entirely unwilling to leave. She let him stay. This was the decision she did not announce, did not negotiate, and absolutely did not examine too closely, because Nia Okoye had not survived 4 years in Ji Huan's world by being sentimental, but she had also not survived it by lying to herself. And the truth was that sending him back to Seoul at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday felt less like boundaries and more like performance. She gave him the couch. She said this clearly with eye contact in a tone that communicated it was not a discussion. He accepted without comment, which was either respect or strategy, and she had decided overnight that she was not going to spend energy determining which. Morning arrived the way Busan mornings did. Salt air first, then light, then the sound of the city remembering itself. Nia was up at 6, which was late by her old standards and early by her new ones, a schedule that was still negotiating its own identity. She made coffee. Real coffee, not the efficient capsule machine from her old office that produced something technically correct but spiritually hollow. She made enough for 2. She did not think about why. Ji Huan was already awake when she came out of the kitchen. He was sitting on her couch in yesterday's suit, jacket folded with surgical precision over the armrest, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading something on his phone with the focused expression of a man who had apparently decided that sleeping in his clothes in a stranger's apartment was simply a thing that had happened and required no further commentary. She set his coffee on the table. He looked up. There's a breach in the Incheon port contracts, he said. Secondary clause, subsection 4. The replacement coordinator missed it. Nia sat down across from him. Good morning to you too. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had said good morning in his head and assumed that counted. Good morning, he said, a beat. The clause. I know about the clause. He stopped. I flagged it in my handover notes, she continued, wrapping both hands around her mug. Page 6. Third paragraph. I wrote this will be missed by anyone who hasn't read the full supplementary agreement from 2021, and I highlighted it in yellow because I was feeling generous. A silence. Hyunsu doesn't read supplementary agreements, Ji Huan said. Hyunsu doesn't read past page 3 of anything. I noted that too. Page 9. Another silence. Longer. The kind that in a lesser man might have been embarrassment and in Ji Huan was something more like a recalibration happening in real time. You documented his weaknesses in the handover. I documented the operational gaps that would need managing, Nia said precisely. It's not personal, it's practical. You did that for whoever replaced you. I did that for the company. He looked at her for a long moment. You were angry when you wrote it. She opened her mouth, closed it. Page 9 reads differently than the rest, he said quietly. The sentences are shorter. She hated that he could do that, had always hated it. The way he parsed language, the way other people parsed spreadsheets, finding the emotional data underneath the professional syntax. It was an extraordinarily inconvenient skill in a boss, and she could only imagine how exhausting it was going to be in whatever category he was currently occupying. I was tired, she said. You were angry and tired, he said. Those are different documents. Ji Huan. I'm not criticizing. He paused in the way he always paused when he was reaching for a word that his vocabulary had and his habits didn't. I'm saying I should have read it sooner. All of it, not just the operational notes. Nia set her mug down. This was the second time in less than 12 hours that he had said something that had no business coming out of a man whose primary love language appeared to be efficient silence. She was beginning to suspect that 4 years of proximity had done something to him that his entire controlled exterior had simply been containing, and that whatever it was had apparently decided that a Busan couch was a reasonable place to surface. What do you actually want? She asked, directly. No softening, no professional framing, no management of the room. Just the question, clean and undecorated. He looked at her. I want you to come back to Seoul. As your assistant? No. The word landed with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its size. Then as what? She asked. I don't have a title for it yet, he said, and for the first time since he had stepped out of that car, she saw something that was not control, not precision, not the managed stillness of a man who had made composure into an art form. She saw uncertainty, real, unpolished, slightly uncomfortable uncertainty. On the face of a man who controlled 3 districts and made senators rearrange their lives around his calendar. It was genuinely the most powerful she had ever seen him look, because power was easy when you knew the outcome. This, sitting on a second-hand couch in Busan with bad coffee and no title and no guarantee, this was something else entirely. You drove 4 hours, she said slowly, without security, without a prepared position, without a single term of negotiation ready. Yes. You, Seo Ji-hwan, walked into a conversation with no exit strategy. Something in his eyes shifted. You're the only person I've ever done that for, he said simply. Nia picked up her coffee. She looked at the sea through her window. She did not say anything for a long time, but she did not tell him to leave. By noon, he had fixed her Wi-Fi. This was not something she had asked for, requested, or even mentioned. She had simply watched from the kitchen doorway as Ji-hwan spent 45 minutes on the floor behind her television. Jacket still folded on the armrest, sleeves still rolled, reading glasses she had never once seen him wear in 4 years perched on his nose. Methodically untangling a router setup that the previous tenant had apparently configured during a period of significant personal crisis. He did not ask for help. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply identified a problem and solved it, the way he solved everything, with the quiet, focused energy of a man who considered half measures a personality defect. When the connection stabilized, he stood up, removed the glasses, and returned to the couch. It was the secondary cable, he said. I know, Nia said. I was going to fix it. When? When it bothered me enough. He looked at her with the expression he reserved for operational inefficiencies he had chosen not to comment on for diplomatic reasons. She looked back with the expression of a woman who was aware she was being silently assessed and had decided it was not her problem. This was, she realized, the first time in 4 years that she had been able to look back. In the office, his attention had always required something from her. A response, a solution, a professional neutrality that kept the interaction inside its appropriate boundaries. She had spent 4 years managing the temperature of every exchange, keeping things functional, keeping herself at the exact professional distance that made her excellent at her job and safe inside his world. Here in her apartment, with his jacket on her armrest and his reading glasses, apparently a thing that existed, there were no boundaries to manage. There was just him and her and an uncomfortable amount of afternoon. He ordered lunch without asking, which she should have expected, because Ji-hwan's relationship with asking was complicated. He did not ask for things he considered already decided. He asked only for things he was genuinely uncertain about, which was a small category and did not include food, logistics, or apparently, whether showing up uninvited to a woman's apartment in another city was appropriate. The food was from a place 20 minutes away that should not have delivered this far. It delivered. Nia did not ask how. She had learned across 4 years that there was a specific category of Ji-hwan outcomes that were better received without forensic examination. They ate at her small table by the window. The sea was doing something cinematic outside, late afternoon light cutting across the water in the particular way that made Busan feel like a city that had been specifically designed to make people reconsider their decisions. Nia was aware of this. She felt it was worth noting internally that the setting was working against her in a way she resented. Tell me about the 11 days, he said. She looked up. What about them? What did you do? She considered deflecting. It would have been easy. She was good at deflecting, had spent years perfecting the professional redirect, the smooth pivot away from anything personal, the conversational equivalent of, "That's not on today's agenda." But he had sat on her couch with uncertainty on his face and no exit strategy. The least she could do was answer a question. "I slept," she said, "properly, 8 hours, 3 nights in a row." Something crossed his face. "You weren't sleeping. I was functioning," she said. "There's a difference. In your world, functioning and thriving look identical from the outside, so nobody checks." He was quiet. "I read," she continued, "fiction, nothing with real-world applications. I walked by the water every morning. I cooked actual meals instead of eating whatever the office kitchen produced at 11 p.m. because a meeting had run 4 hours over." She paused. "I remembered what my own preferences felt like." "What do you mean?" "I mean that somewhere in year 2, I stopped making choices based on what I wanted and started making them based on what the day required, what you required, what the next meeting required." She turned her mug slowly. "I forgot I had preferences. That's not a complaint. It's just what happened." Jihuan set down his chopsticks. He looked at her with the full, still attention that she had once watched make a room full of men in expensive suits suddenly find reasons to straighten their posture. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. That's not acceptable. I know that too." "Nia, I'm not angry anymore," she said, and meant it. The anger had mostly burned itself out somewhere around day 4 in Busan, replaced by something quieter and more honest. "I made choices too. I could have said something. I could have asked for different terms. I didn't because I was—" She stopped, looked at the water. "Because I was afraid of what asking would change." The table was very small. She was suddenly aware of exactly how small. "What were you afraid it would change?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. And here was the thing about Seo Ji-hwan that his enemies never understood, and his allies only partially grasped. He did not ask questions he didn't already know the shape of the answer to. He asked them because he wanted to hear them said out loud, because he believed, in whatever private philosophy operated underneath the empire and the silence, that things unsaid had a way of becoming structural problems. She had written that in his voice once, in a memo, about port operations. She had not realized until this exact moment that she had understood it personally. "Everything," she said honestly. He reached across the small table. He did not take her hand, did not make it dramatic or declarative. He simply placed his hand next to hers on the table, close enough to be intentional, with the patient stillness of a man who had driven 4 hours to say something and was prepared to wait the appropriate amount of time for its response. Nia looked at his hand, looked at her own, at the sea beyond the window, doing its unhelpfully cinematic thing. She thought about 4 years of managed distance and 11 days of genuine peace and the particular loneliness of being excellent at something inside a world that could swallow you whole if you let it. She thought about reading glasses she had never known existed. She thought about the Wi-Fi. She turned her hand over. Not a decision, exactly. A beginning. His fingers closed around hers with the careful, deliberate pressure of a man who understood that some things, once held, required you to be worthy of them. Outside, Busan continued its evening. Inside, something that had been suspended for 4 years finally, quietly, landed. Seoul found out on a Thursday, not because either of them announced anything. Seo Ji-hwan did not make announcements about his personal life. His personal life did not, historically, exist in any form that required announcing. And Nia Okoye, who had spent 4 years being professionally invisible inside his world, had not suddenly developed an interest in visibility. Seoul found out because Ji-hwan came back from Busan on a Wednesday morning and canceled 3 meetings. In 4 years, he had canceled exactly 1 meeting, and that was because of an incident involving the Incheon port that had required his physical presence and had technically constituted a minor international situation. His staff had discussed it in whispers for 6 weeks. 3 cancellations in 1 morning was not a schedule adjustment. It was a weather event. By noon, the 34th floor was operating at the specific frequency of people who were working very hard and thinking about something else entirely. By 2 o'clock, his head of operations had developed a nervous cough that appeared whenever the organizational structure felt uncertain. By 4, the CFO had walked past Ji-hwan's office door 3 times without knocking, which was his version of a wellness check. Ji-hwan noticed all of it. He said nothing. He was on the phone with Nia. This was new territory for both of them, and they were navigating it with the particular careful energy of 2 people who were professionally excellent at everything except this. Their first 3 phone calls had the slightly formal quality of people who had communicated daily for 4 years through the clean medium of tasks and schedules and operational necessity, and were now required to talk without an agenda. It was for approximately the first 10 minutes of the first call, deeply awkward. Then she had made a dry comment about the Incheon clause, and he had responded with something that was technically a joke. Quiet, precise, landed without performance. And they had found the register. The one that had always existed underneath the professional layer. The one that 4 years of appropriate distance had kept carefully managed. Turns out the distance had been doing a lot of heavy lifting. Hyeon Soo sent me a message, she said on Thursday morning. Ji-hwan, who was reviewing a document he had read 3 times and retained approximately none of, looked up from his desk. What kind of message? A polite one. He introduced himself formally, summarized his first week, and then asked, very respectfully, if I had any guidance on your coffee preference because apparently you've sent back 3 cups this week and he's beginning to suspect it's personal. A pause. It might be slightly personal, Ji-hwan said. Ji-hwan. The ratio is wrong. The ratio, Nia said with the measured tone of a woman exercising restraint, is written on a card in the top left drawer of my old desk, which I left there specifically to prevent this situation. He hasn't opened that drawer. Why not? I believe he's afraid of it. She laughed. The sound of it moved through the phone and settled somewhere in his chest in a way he was still getting used to, the sensation of something that had previously been structural tension simply releasing. Tell him to open the drawer, she said. You could tell him yourself, Ji-hwan said, carefully, without pressure, a beat. Is that an offer or an opening position? She asked. It's an observation, he said, with implications. What neither of them had discussed with any directness was what returning would actually mean. Nia had been clear, with herself in the quiet mornings by the Busan Sea, that she could not come back as his assistant. Not because the work had been beneath her. The work had been extraordinary, and she was honest enough to admit she missed parts of it with the specific longing of someone who had been genuinely good at something and walked away from it mid-season. But the structure that had allowed her to disappear inside his world, to become so essential she forgot to be her own person, that structure could not be rebuilt. She needed different terms. The question was whether he understood what that meant. She got her answer on Friday. A document arrived at her Busan apartment, delivered by courier, not digitally, which was either romance or strategy, and she was no longer trying to distinguish between the two where he was concerned. Inside was a single page on So Group letterhead, not a contract, not an offer letter, a proposal, not operational, not employment-related, a proposal for what he was describing in the precise language of a man who had apparently decided to apply his entire business vocabulary to his personal life because it was the only architecture he had as a partnership. Equal terms, defined boundaries, mutual accountability. And at the bottom, in handwriting rather than print, because apparently Seo Ji-hwan contained multitudes, a single line. I don't have a title for this yet. I'm open to negotiation. Nia read the document twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. He answered before the second ring, which told her everything about how the last 48 hours had been for him. You wrote me a partnership proposal, she said. I wrote what I understood, he said. If the terms need adjustment, Ji-hwan, yes. You wrote me a partnership proposal, she said again, but differently this time. Softer. With the particular quality of something that was almost but not quite disbelief. A pause. Was that wrong? He asked. And there it was again. The uncertainty, real and unpolished, from a man who had never once second-guessed a business decision in his professional life and was now apparently checking his work like a first-year associate. No, she said quietly. It was exactly right. She heard him exhale, just barely, just enough. The line at the bottom, she said, about negotiation. Yes, I have a counteroffer. Tell me. I come back to Seoul, she said. Not to the 34th floor, not to the desk outside your office, to the city. I find my own work. There are 3 organizations that have been trying to hire me since before I resigned, which you probably already know. I know about 2 of them, he said. There are 3. A brief silence that contained an entire conversation about information and its management. Noted, he said. I come back to Seoul, she continued, and we figure out what this is without a reporting structure between us. Without me being essential to your operations, without the power imbalance that made me disappear in the first place. Silence. Real silence this time, the kind he used when he was actually thinking, not performing thought. Agreed, he said. She blinked. Just like that? Nia. His voice was even and certain, and the most unguarded she had ever heard it. I drove to Busan without a plan. I slept on a second-hand couch. I fixed your Wi-Fi. A pause. I wrote a partnership proposal by hand. She pressed her lips together. Your point? She managed. My point, he said quietly, is that I have already agreed to everything. I'm simply waiting for you to believe it. Outside her window, the Busan Sea made its argument one last time. She had already made her decision. She just needed to finish packing. She came back on a Tuesday. This felt appropriate. Nia had always considered Tuesdays the most honest day of the week. None of Monday's theatrical fresh starts, none of Wednesday's false sense of midpoint achievement. Tuesday simply was what it was, which was exactly the energy she wanted for walking back into Seoul with one suitcase, 3 job offers, and a situation she still did not have a clean word for. Ji-hwan had offered to send a car. She took the train. Not because she was making a statement, she was finished making statements through logistics. That particular chapter of her life was closed, but because she wanted the 4 hours. Wanted to sit with the Han River appearing outside the window as Seoul announced itself on the horizon, and feel whatever she was going to feel about returning without the managed silence of a company vehicle and a driver who would report the emotional weather of the journey back to his employer. She felt ready, which surprised her. She had expected to feel complicated, had packed for complicated, had spent the last 3 days in Busan doing the emotional equivalent of checking every drawer and under every surface for anything she might be leaving unexamined. She had journaled, which she never did, had called her mother in Lagos, who had listened to the entire story with the focused attention of a woman who had raised Nia to be precisely nobody's fool, and was now performing the delicate maternal calculation of whether this particular man qualified as an exception to that rule. Her mother's verdict, delivered after a silence that lasted long enough to be its own form of commentary. He drove himself? Yes. No security? No. Another silence. Send me a photo, her mother said. Not of him, of the apartment he's offering. I want to see if he has taste. Naya had smiled for the rest of that evening. Seoul received her the way it always had, without ceremony, without sentiment, with the magnificent indifference of a city that had 10 million people's worth of business to conduct and could not pause for anyone's personal narrative. She liked that about it, had always liked it. Seoul did not perform welcome, it simply continued, and you either matched its pace or you didn't. She matched it. Her new apartment was in Mapo. Her choice, her lease, her name on the contract. 2 bedrooms because she had decided that having space was no longer a luxury she was willing to negotiate away. A kitchen with a window, a reasonable commute to 2 of the 3 organizations she was in conversation with, one of which had offered her a director-level position that would have made her 4 years ago self need a moment alone to process. She signed with the second organization. Not because the offer was better, it wasn't, quite, but because the work was more interesting, the leadership structure had fewer of the particular power dynamics she was done navigating, and the director who interviewed her had spent 40 minutes asking about her ideas rather than her experience, which told her everything she needed to know about the culture. She started on a Monday. By Wednesday, she had reorganized the briefing structure. By Friday, her new director had sent her a message that read, I don't know what you did to the Thursday debrief format, but everyone came out of it looking like they'd understood something for the first time. Whatever you did, keep doing it. Naya read the message, smiled, and made a note to formalize the process. She was, it turned out, still herself. Seoul and 4 years inside an empire had not changed that. They had just buried it temporarily under the weight of someone else's world. She and Ji-hwan had dinner on her 3rd Friday back, not at one of his usual restaurants, the private rooms and the curated menus, and the staff who materialized and disappeared with the timing of people who had been trained to be furniture. He had asked where she wanted to go, which was still a sentence that sounded slightly unnatural in his voice, like a word in a language he was studying with genuine commitment, but had not yet made instinctive. She chose a Korean barbecue place in Mapo that had 15 seats, a handwritten menu, and a ventilation system that was doing its best under considerable pressure. He arrived exactly on time in a dark coat, no security, and the expression of a man who was taking in the 15 seats and the handwritten menu and making a private decision to be entirely fine with this. He was entirely fine with this. They sat across from each other with the grill between them and ordered enough food for an operational meeting, which was apparently just how both of them approached meals when no one was performing restraint. She grilled. He watched her do it with the attention he gave things he found quietly remarkable. She pretended not to notice the way she had once pretended not to notice everything, except that now the pretending was affectionate rather than protective. Different thing entirely. How's Hyun-soo? She asked. Improving, Ji-hwan said. He opened the drawer. The coffee card. He laminated it. She looked up. He laminated the coffee instruction card. And framed it, Jihuan said, with the micro-expression of a man who had feelings about this that he was choosing to process privately. It's on the wall beside his desk. Nia pressed her lips together so hard she briefly lost feeling in them. She started. Don't. I'm just saying, Nia. He framed it, Jihuan. I am aware, she laughed. Fully, genuinely, the kind of laugh that had no professional considerations attached to it, the kind that belonged only to her and arrived now without the old instinct to contain it. Jihuan watched her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of open. Not soft, exactly. He was not a soft man and was not going to become one, and she did not want him to. But present. Fully, deliberately present in a way that cost him something, and which he offered anyway. When she settled, he reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the table between them, a small card, plain. His handwriting. She picked it up. On it was a single word, followed by a question mark. Partner? Nia looked at the card, looked at him. You couldn't put this in the proposal, she said. The proposal was the argument, he said. This is the question. She turned the card over. On the back, also in his handwriting, still open to negotiation. Terms to be determined, no reporting structure, no power imbalance, no disappearing. She read that last line twice. No disappearing. Not a command, not directed at her alone, a mutual term. A door they were both agreeing to keep open from the inside. She set the card down. She picked up the tongs and turned the meat on the grill with the focused attention of a woman who was feeling something large and had decided to feel it without managing it. My mother wants to meet you, she said. The silence that followed was the most expressive she had ever heard from him. That's non-negotiable, she said. That term is not open. Another silence, shorter. Understood, he said. She looked up at him across the grill, across the smoke and the noise and the 15-seat restaurant that had no idea it was hosting the most significant negotiation either of them had conducted in years. Yes, she said. He did not perform relief, did not exhale dramatically or reach across the table with any of the gestures that the moment might have licensed. He simply held her gaze with the steady, certain attention of a man who had driven to Busan without a plan and had known, somewhere beneath the empire and the composure, that it was the best decision he had ever made without a strategy. One condition, she added. Name it. Next time you track someone across 2 cities using their location history, she said, lead with that information immediately. Do not send the phone first. It is deeply unsettling, and the dramatic pause serves no one. Something moved in his eyes. It served the narrative, he said. Jihuan. You're here, he said simply. It worked. She pointed the tongs at him. He did not look remotely concerned. Outside, Seoul continued its magnificent, indifferent evening. Inside, 2 people who had spent 4 years being professionally precise about everything except this sat across a smoking grill in a 15-seat restaurant and began, without ceremony, without announcement, the slow and careful work of choosing each other. On purpose. Without paperwork. And this time, with absolutely nowhere left to disappear to. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know that Nia Okoye was never the one who needed saving. She needed space. She needed terms. She needed a man willing to drive 4 hours with no plan and fix her Wi-Fi and write a partnership proposal by hand before she believed he was serious. She got all 3. Hit like if you believe that the right person shows up without a script. Subscribe if you're here for more stories about women who leave on their own terms and come back on better ones. And drop a comment telling us, was the laminated coffee card the most romantic detail in this entire story? Because we think it might have been.